Good morning. Good to have you with us. I'm Joe Fryer. Savannah is off. We begin this hour with the growing backlash to President Trump's efforts to send the National Guard to Democratic-controlled cities. Over the weekend, protests erupted in Portland and Chicago against the ongoing immigration raids by ICE. That prompted the White House to announce it would move National Guard troops from other states like California and Texas to those cities. But last night, a federal judge in Oregon temporarily blocked the Trump administration's efforts to send troops from California, or for that matter, any other state, to Portland. The White House's tactics blasted by the governors of both Oregon and Illinois.
There's no need for military intervention in Oregon. There's no insurrection in Portland. There's no threat to national security.
What Trump is doing is untethered from the facts. That's the case. He was claiming that it's mayhem on the on the streets of Portland. He's saying that, Chicago is a war zone. None of that is true. They're just making this up. And then what do? They fire tear gas and smoke grenades, and they make it look like it's a war zone.
NBC News Washington correspondent Alice Barr joins us now with the very latest. Alice, good morning. So tell us a little more about what we saw at these protests over the weekend and why the White House is saying it has decided to deploy National Guard troops from other states like California and Texas.
Joe, good morning. So you played a little bit from President Trump off the top of the show saying that Portland is burning to the ground, that insurrectionists, he says, have taken over. And that is really how he is framing this, that it's an emergency situation that requires intervention. Certainly, you're hearing counter arguments, as you just played as well, from the governor of Oregon refuting that kind of description. And we also saw an op-ed published Sunday in the Oregonian by the Portland police chief, who he didn't outright denounce President Trump's deployment of the National Guard, but he said that national portrayals of Portland for the reason that the Trump given for sending in the National Guard is that police are not responding to public disorder. And the police chief said that just because you're not seeing officers wearing tactical gear lining up in front of crowds doesn't mean they're not responding. He said that research shows that those kinds of tactics can often escalate crowd behavior. So they're using a layered approach, as he put it, to manage it. And he has said that the protests have remained contained to about one city block, Joe.
So, Alice, much of this is going to be settled in the courts. Walk us through this ruling from that federal judge in Oregon. Like so many rulings we've seen this year, it's temporary, but for now it does block the deployment of National Guard troops to Portland from other states. We should know, this judge was appointed by President Trump in his first term. So what did the judge say? And is the Trump administration, so far as we can tell, planning to adhere to it?
Yeah, as far as we can tell, that is the big question. This is all very fresh. This was a rare Sunday evening order to have this come out in the first place, blocking the deployment of troops from California, from anywhere else to go into Portland, Oregon. So far appears to be holding, but certainly there's a lot that yet has to shake out today. One quote that we heard from the federal judge who made this ruling, and by the way, she issued both rulings, the one blocking the Oregon National Guard troops and the one blocking out-of-state National Guard troops. And she said, quote, "This country has a long-standing and foundational tradition of resistance to government overreach, especially in the form of military intrusion into civil affairs." So that's how she's framing her ruling, and the Trump administration has now filed a motion with an appeals court. Pause, and they're accusing that judge of, quote, impermissibly second-guessing President Trump's military judgments. The governors out there, everybody who's kind of been up in arms over this, is accusing the Trump administration of trying to circumvent that original ruling, say you can't put National Guard troops from Oregon into Portland, by then saying, okay, well, then let's send them from out of state. And again, both have now been shut down, Joe.
All right. Alice Barr, thank you so much. In what could be the prelude to a breakthrough, talks between Hamas, Israel, and the U.S. are set to take place in Egypt today. At issue, President Trump's peace plan to end the war in Gaza. This follows a busy weekend for Middle East diplomacy ahead of the second anniversary of the October 7th attacks. Hamas announced on Friday it would release all the remaining hostages held in Gaza. President Trump then told Israel, which has already accepted his proposal, to pause its bombardment of the enclave. Despite that, the Palestinian Health Ministry says dozens of people were killed in strikes over the weekend. President Trump said he expects negotiations to last a couple days and that Hamas faces, quote, obliteration if it refuses to cede power in Gaza. NBC News Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons is here with the very latest. Keir, good morning. Good to have you here in New York. Let's start with today, these peace talks. What can we expect? And for Hamas right now, what appears to be the sticking points?
Well, get this, Joe. The senior Hamas representative who will be at these talks, Khalil al-Hayya, was one of those who was the target of an attempted assassination by Israel just weeks ago. And now he is in these talks with Ron Dermer representing Prime Minister Netanyahu, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law, representing the Trump administration. So that's how far forward we have moved. That being said, a sign of how much things are already slipping, if you like, President Trump's 20-point peace plan said all this has to happen now. It was very immediate, and President Trump continues to be demanding about how quickly he wants this to happen, and yet we're into negotiations, and those negotiations have a lot of detail to pick over before we get to the kind of peace in our time that the 20-point peace plan talked about.
Obviously, one of the important parts of this is releasing the remaining hostages. Do we have any idea of what that might even look like?
Yeah, the Israelis say that is the first thing that needs to happen. That's the primary piece of this. And Hamas, in response to President Trump's 20-point peace plan, agreed to release those around 48 hostages, some of them dead, some of them alive still, it is believed. How does that happen? You remember the previous release where Hamas was there in military fatigues with guns and things, almost putting on a show of the release. The Israelis won't want that. There's also continuing fighting. So how do you release them amidst that fighting? I mean, there are questions simply about that point. And the Israelis say that has to happen before anything else can happen.
And you mentioned the fighting continues. I mean, President Trump wanted Israel to stop its strikes on Gaza after Hamas did express this willingness to move forward with the plan. But smoke could still be seen coming from the enclave through the weekend. I mean, do we know what's happening on the ground there in Gaza?
The fighting hasn't stopped. As simple as that. The Israelis have not withdrawn, and they have not stopped bombarding Gaza City, perhaps to a lesser extent than they were, but it's still ongoing. And again, the peace plan said the fighting, as soon as both sides agree, it should happen now. Other questions still amidst all this: has Hamas or will Hamas agree to lay down its arms? Will it agree not to be part of the political process? Hamas, in its response, said it wants to be part of the political process. So this is very positive, but there are so many issues to resolve.
20 points, and every point has a point of contention.
And we haven't even talked about how you actually rebuild Gaza. That's just something for later.
All right, Keir, good to have you with us. Thank you so much. Let's continue the conversation more on the Gaza ceasefire talks and bring in the host of Oh My World on YouTube, Hagar Shamali. She's also the former spokesperson to the U.S. mission to the UN and the former NSC director for Syria and Lebanon. Hagar, always good to have you with us. So let's hear your thoughts on President Trump's peace plan. Do you think it's realistic? How do you see it?
Well, I have hope. I think, Keir said it well at the end, where it's a positive development. And I don't want to say that I'm optimistic. It's very hard to be optimistic about these things, but I do have hope. And the reason is because he's really putting in investing all of his political capital into this by trying to push a deal that brings an entire end to the war, releases all the remaining hostages at once. And he's trying to really expend his capital by putting this pressure on Netanyahu. And also, by the way, and this is an important point, he gave a huge win to Qatar last week with the security agreement that he gave, which is essentially amounts to an Article 5 level agreement, meaning if Qatar is attacked, we go to their defense. So Qatar needs to deliver Hamas. And so with that amount of pressure and the amount of countries that have agreed onto this, there is some hope there. But of course, again, I mean, Hamas sticking out on this point about the fact that they won't commit to the question of laying down their arms. This is going to be a very sticky point in the talks today.
Yeah, and even though Hamas has said it would release all the remaining hostages, we've got unanswered question when it comes to the those things, disarmament, who's going to govern Gaza. At this point, what do you think are the main sticking points? And what you mentioned there, the fact that this is so big, it's such a massive attempt to end everything. Is that part of the problem, that you're trying to address so many issues that have been difficult to even tackle over these last 2 years?
Well, the details that Keir brought up at the beginning, for example, these are the ones that I have hope for being worked out. Things like, how will the hostages be? How will they be released? What are the details of those? What is the state of affairs on the ground? And that is something that's achievable. The question of laying down the arms, the reason I'm very concerned about this, and by the way, even when it comes to future governing of Gaza, Hamas said in its statement, and again, it's a terrorist group, so let's take that with a grain of salt, but in its statement said that they were fine with relinquishing governing control over to another Palestinian authority, or a Palestinian entity of some kind that has the legitimacy of the Palestinian people and so on. When it came to the question of anything else, they didn't address disarming. They just said, as for the remaining points of the plan, this is up to the Palestinian people in accordance with international law, blah, blah, blah. The problem with that is that had a lot of this been up to the Palestinian people, there wouldn't be a war right now. Hamas wouldn't be using those people as a human shield, which is what they're doing. So that's really just an effort to buy time, to be vague, to have their cake and eat it too. The best I think we can hope for is you get to a deal where they agree on the release of hostages and to the preliminary terms of this deal, and it might fall apart later when Hamas inevitably tries to get arms again. This is how I see that is unfortunately the best case scenario.
And tomorrow, of course, is October 7th. That'll be the second anniversary of the conflict and the attack on Israel. Israel's goal was just the end of Hamas. Gaza, its stronghold, is decimated right now. If we do get to a deal and it holds, even if it is for a little bit, did either side achieve any of their goals here?
Hamas certainly didn't achieve any of its goals. Its goal is to obliterate Israel and to put an Islamic caliphate in its place. So they are certainly no closer to that. And on the contrary, they are much, much farther away. Unfortunately, they've invited the destruction and suffering on their people, which is just the worst piece of this. So they achieved absolutely nothing other than, unfortunately, probably galvanizing Gazans and pushing them further into extremism or into an anti-Israel sentiment. On the Israeli side, they've significantly decimated Hamas, and I don't see a future for Hamas governing Gaza at all. And also, by the way, I mean, in the process, they remade the Middle East. They crumbled the axis of resistance. Hezbollah was decapitated. The Houthis are licking their wounds, and Iran has no defense. So in that regard, Israel did achieve a lot. But I understand the goal, of course, of wanting to make sure Hamas completely surrenders.
All right. Hagar Shamali, always good to have you with us. Thank you so much. The government shutdown is entering a new week, and lawmakers are not any closer to a deal. The Senate is slated to be in session this afternoon. The House of Representatives has no plans to return to Washington until next week. Leaders from both sides are digging in and trying to pin the blame on the other party. NBC News politics reporter Megan Leibowitz joins us now with the latest on this. Megan, good morning. So the last time we had a government shutdown was President Trump's first term. It was back in 2018. That one lasted more than a month. What can we expect today when the Senate returns to Capitol Hill?
Yeah, that's right. So the Senate will come back this afternoon, where we're expecting them to vote yet again on these Republican and Democrat-led versions of these funding bills. Now, remember, these bills have already been voted on multiple times, and they've failed every single time. Now, over the weekend, there was no indication that there's been further movement to potentially push either of these bills over the finish line here. And like you mentioned, the House is not going to be in session this week either. So originally, the House was expected to come back tomorrow, but that changed and was pushed back to next week. And so we're not expecting any votes in the House either. Now, Republicans over the weekend were continuing to push Democrats to switch their votes to try to back this short-term continuing resolution, which would provide temporary funding for the government. But for Democratic leaders, the message has been continuing to be, let's address health care first. That's been a top issue for Democrats, where they want to address these ACA subsidies that are set to expire, Joe.
Yeah, and no surprise, obviously, these congressional leaders are trying to blame each other nearly a week into the shutdown. What are they saying about just where any negotiations stand right now? How dug in is each side, as many federal workers now do face the potential for layoffs?
Yeah, so both sides were continuing to blame each other over the weekend, accusing each other of not being open to negotiations or not negotiating in good faith. I want you to take a listen to what House Speaker Mike Johnson and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries had to say over the weekend. Take a listen.
The reason the government is closed is because Chuck Schumer and 43 of his Democrat colleagues in the Senate have decided now to vote multiple times to keep the government closed. We need them to turn the lights back on so that everyone can do their work. The House did our work. We passed a bipartisan, clean, continuing resolution to keep the government open.
Last time there was a conversation with Republican leadership was in the White House meeting last Monday, and unfortunately, since that point in time, Republicans, including Donald Trump, have gone radio silent. Our view is that we will find bipartisan common ground with our Republican colleagues to reopen the government.
And like you mentioned as well, this comes as White House officials have said that this could lead to layoffs of federal workers if this continued. And President Trump even said last night that this is happening right now. So that's something that we're keeping an eye on today as well.
And Megan, lawmakers might be pointing the finger at each other, but many Americans just feel there is plenty of blame to go around. A lot of Americans, they're in the middle. They don't have a strong, belief in one party or the other. What is the polling data telling us right now?
Yeah, so I want to point you to a new CBS News YouGov poll that came out over the weekend where more people tended to blame Republicans in Congress and President Trump for the shutdown. So 39% of respondents cast blame mostly on the president and the GOP for the shutdown, while about 30% cast blame on Democrats, about 31% said that they were all equally to blame. Now, a caveat here is that, this is very early still. And now it's coming still as federal workers are not getting paychecks, and we're seeing federal programs and services that are on pause right now as the shutdown is happening. But the longer that this continues, the more that we're going to be watching to see where this public opinion polling plays out and if that ultimately impacts how lawmakers are thinking about their future votes to come, Joe.
All right, Megan, thank you so much. While the government remains shut down, the Supreme Court now open for business. It's the first Monday in October, which means the justices are starting a new session. And the docket is already packed with high-profile issues that include several key challenges to President Trump's attempts to try and advance his executive power. For more, let's bring in NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos, who joins us here on set. So, Danny, let's start with that. What are the big cases that center on the president's authority that the Supreme Court's going to have to tackle in one way or another here?
Yeah, just like you previewed, there are a lot of cases that deal with fundamental issues of presidential power. But if I were to pick the big one, it would be tariffs. Whether or not Trump's use of his executive power is such that it exceeds his statutory authority. But really, more than that, tens of billions of dollars are at stake. And if they were wrongfully collected, how do we return that? It's a difficult issue for most people to understand. But in terms of import, both the executive power question and the simple dollar amounts involved, it is of staggering importance among that will define executive power.
And we saw a couple other cases on there. Of course, birthright citizenship, that is a constitutional issue, so we expect the Supreme Court to tackle that. And also these firings. You have Lisa Cook, who's on the Federal Reserve, the president trying to fire him. This is something we expect the court to take up, right?
Exactly right. And the birthright citizenship issue, for example, it really affects statistically a tiny percentage of the population. And in fact, no one's looking to do away with all of birthright citizenship, just that narrow class of people that two sides debate whether or not they were born subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. What exactly does that mean? But a bigger question is, can the president, through use of an executive, undo something that we've all taken for granted for centuries? For the idea, the idea being in America that even if your parents are here illegally, born here, you're born on the soil, jus soli, the law of the soil, you get birthright citizenship. So this is really a question of how much the Supreme Court is willing to look at and possibly undo hundreds of years of established constitution because the president interprets it in a certain way. So that's very significant. Meanwhile, the presidential firings certainly are more important here and now. They affect more people in the real world. But issues like birthright citizenship, for historical reasons, are just fascinating to people like me who will be watching closely.
Beyond the presidential authority issues, what else are you looking for coming up in this term?
I mean, you've got so many different cases. You've got, I mean, there's a conversion therapy case. We still are dealing with conversion therapy cases out of Colorado. A Christian therapist argues that it violates the therapist's free speech rights to not be able to give conversion therapy. And of course, that's the kind of therapy where a trans person is encouraged to go back to their original sex at birth or whatever the case may be. That is an interesting issue. Again, it affects a small fraction of the population, but it's an issue that people can understand. It's an issue that's been in the public debate for many years now. And it's interesting to me that these cases are still percolating up to the Supreme Court. We'll see where the court comes down on that issue.
Jeffrey Epstein's associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, she wants the Supreme Court to overturn her conviction. What's the issue here? What's the argument?
Okay, if the Supreme Court takes up this issue, be warned. Ghislaine Maxwell has a non-zero chance of prevailing. And in fact, had this case been brought across the river in New Jersey in a different federal circuit, she might have already prevailed and never have been prosecuted. So in other words, the issue before Ghislaine Maxwell is whether or not a line in in Jeffrey Epstein's cooperation agreement, his plea agreement, said the United States shall not prosecute any of his potential co-conspirators, whether that bound just the U.S. Attorney's Office in that district or the United States everywhere. It's issue that is very meaningful to criminal defense attorneys like me. So I'll be watching that very, very. By the way, the Second Circuit is really in the minority here. Ghislaine Maxwell has a good chance if the court takes it up.
And a reminder to folks, some of these issues could be settled relatively quickly, considering how quickly the court usually moves. But some of these we will not know for months what the court decides.
Months and months and months. Yes,
right.
Joe.
Yep. We'll be chatting with you about it. Danny, thank you so much. Time now for weather. The flood threat along Florida's Atlantic coast after high tides overran neighborhoods this weekend. On top of that, more than 4 inches of drenching rain has fallen since Friday, inundating roads. And now more places are at risk, getting up to another inch of rain today. NBC meteorologist Andrea Romero joins us now with the latest. Andrea, good to see you.
Thanks, Joe. Good morning to you. And we're going to talk about this dynamic weather pattern that's setting up across the country. And we're going to start off with the rain that continues to affect here parts of Florida into the central Gulf Coast. In fact, this morning here in parts of Louisiana, we had some tornado warnings, some flash flood warnings issued. And we're still expecting this onshore flow along the eastern coast of Florida to bring in more rain into this region. We do continue to have a flood watch in effect from Daytona Beach all the way to Jupiter Island. And moving a little bit further north, we also have this flash flood risk that's extending from Arkansas into the Midwest, especially here in Kentucky. If you're anywhere in this area, or you have a way to receive your local weather team's weather alerts today, because we do have the chance of 1 to 3 inches of rainfall accumulating in this area from today into Tuesday. So we can have the risk of some flash flooding develop in that area. And that's, of course, due to this cold front that's going to be moving eastward today, tomorrow, bringing that scattered rain, the chance of some flooding into the region. Ahead of this front is where we've been enjoying that record warmth this weekend. Temperatures today are still expected above average, especially over New England, where we could have some record warm temperatures again today. And behind the front, we can see that cool down that we're feeling. Today's highs only in the 50s and 60s over here in the Dakotas. So we're talking about chillier temperatures, but more seasonable for this time of year. In fact, we do have some freeze watches, freeze warnings, frost advisories that have been issued for this morning for this region here. So we can definitely feel that cool down. Now, as far as the tropics, we do have a 70% chance of a tropical depression forming later this week along this development zone. The good news is it seems like it's going to be heading north before it approaches the eastern coast of the U.S., so we should be safe, but of course, we'll keep an eye on it. Back to you, Joe.
All right, Andrea, thank you so much. In Alabama, a weekend of celebration turned tragic after a mass shooting Saturday night. The shots were fired in downtown Montgomery, the scene of the Alabama State Fair and some other public events. Police say 2 people were killed, a 17-year-old boy and a 43-year-old woman. 12 more people were injured, 5 of them reportedly with life-threatening injuries. Officers now believe one of the shooting victims was targeted and that others in the area were also armed, then reacted by pulling out their own weapons. This morning, investigators are still searching for any suspects and a motive. Former NFL quarterback Mark Sanchez was arrested after an alleged early morning altercation in Indianapolis this weekend. Police say he was stabbed during a fight outside a bar where he was allegedly the instigator. Sanchez was hospitalized and is now facing several charges. NBC News national correspondent Aaron Gilchrist has that story.
New details emerging about the fight that sent former NFL quarterback Mark to a hospital in critical condition.
Male complainant says he is behind the West End Hotel and was attacked.
Initially, police reported that Sanchez had been stabbed early Saturday morning outside a bar. Later, a police affidavit suggesting Sanchez was the aggressor, describing surveillance video showing Mr. Sanchez is then seen throwing the victim to the ground on the west side of the alley. Sanchez was in Indianapolis to cover the Colts-Raiders game as an analyst for Fox Sports, his colleagues addressing the incident on air.
Mark Sanchez was involved in an incident that, to be honest, we're all still trying to wrap our heads around.
Prosecutors say Sanchez argued with a delivery truck driver after a dispute about where his truck was parked in an alley. The affidavit alleging Sanchez shoved the victim multiple times. He pepper sprayed Sanchez. Police wrote the victim told the detective that Mr. Sanchez smelled of alcohol and his speech was slurred, adding that amid the attack he thought to himself, "This guy is trying to kill me," before pulling out a knife and stabbing Sanchez ultimately 3 or 4 times, according to the affidavit. Prosecutors saying a disagreement between a 38-year-old former professional athlete and a 69-year-old man should not have escalated into violence. Sanchez played 10 seasons in the NFL and joined Fox Sports in 2021. Charging documents show Sanchez was stabbed in the upper torso, while the other man had a cut on his face. Investigators also writing that Sanchez told a detective all he could remember was grabbing for a window. The ex-football star now facing misdemeanor charges of battery and public intoxication. Aaron Gilchrist, NBC News.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.